Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox. This is the third part of manufacturing history, and in these episodes we're going to talk about the things that we are doing and how we are responding to what we are hearing. Wars, as you know, are often a fight over land or money, and increasingly over the last century, oil has become a proxy for money itself. It's through the control of oil that several imperial governments maintain their economic control over the world. America is no exception to this, using OPEC and petrodollar economics to strengthen our own currency and increase our soft power capabilities across the world. And we do this in coordination with Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing nations in the region. Increasingly, oil is the blood of war, and it plays an important part in this conflict as well. Don't get me wrong, Russia is more likely invading for wheat than oil, or precisely the fertile land that grows the wheat. Without Soviet-era connections, Russia's barrenness has become a bit of an obstacle to its growth. After the Munich Security Council, where Volodymyr Zelensky called upon Europe to take action against Russia, Germany, being the endpoint of Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2 pipelines, decided that perhaps because of this they would sign an agreement with America that said that if Putin were to escalate in Ukraine, that they would turn off the newly completed Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I think it's foolish to try to say that any one particular thing led to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, even if the timing of it does seem strange, and I think that it was inevitable even if everyone did the right thing. However, this particular sanction is likely to have some proximate effect on the exact timing of the Russian invasion. And while I just got done giving Biden credit for not pursuing these types of preemptive sanctions, this does appear to be an exception to that. And it was met with blowback, as Russia and Saudi Arabia colluded to increase their oil prices even further to the rest of the world simultaneously, which has driven up oil prices to the profit of the Saudi monarchy and the Russian state throughout this crisis. I do want to give Joe Biden a bit of credit, though, for being willing to sanction U.S. oil imports from Russia, even though Russia doesn't make up a lot of the oil that this country imports, and even though we are a bit more energy independent than other nations, especially those in Europe. We are actually even a net exporter of energy. While he will likely be politically blamed for this as the reason that oil prices are about to go up, really most of that cause is a combination of price gouging from oil-producing nations, as well as companies within the country that are seeing this as an excuse to raise prices and thus their profits even higher. Make no mistake, watch these oil companies because their stock prices will likely go up because of this, even as American oil consumption will likely go down. It's important to realize and remember that a lot of these price gouging issues could have been taken care of by Joe Biden, and one way to do this would even be the nationalization of our oil industry, which is a step that I don't think that he's likely to take. However, it is important to note that he could do this, and it's important to note that there are a number of countries, both foreign dictatorships and peaceful democracies, that have done this to the great benefit of their people. In these states, this has enabled the government to more effectively respond to internal problems. The "how are you going to pay for it" question becomes a lot easier to answer, at least, when nationalized oil profits are high and capable of paying for a great number of public works and social safety net programs even by itself. In fact, there's a theory that I heard that I think could work very well through nationalization, and that is that there be sort of a dividend made from American oil companies that would be used to fund effectively a universal basic income for the American people off of our oil industry. And this is actually pretty similar to how a lot of other oil-rich countries do, especially the more democratic ones, where the money tends to be spread around a lot more than just enriching a monarchy, or a few key oligarchs in Russia. The most immediate benefit of nationalization, in addition to factoring out the oil lobby in the decision-making process of the United States, will be that this would give the government the ability to create price controls and factor out the types of price gouging at the pump that we are seeing today. Because, make no mistake, the majority of the inflation of the price that you are paying to fill up your vehicle doesn't come from the effects of policy, but instead the exacerbation of those effects because of individual greed.
Oil prices dropped below $100 a barrel on Tuesday, down from $130 a barrel last week. Senator Bernie Sanders pointed out the dip in costs, saying, "Why is the price of oil lower today than it was in 2014, while the average price for a gallon of gas is 80 cents more?" The answer, corporate greed.
But let's return our focus to the Nordstream Pipeline and the history of sanctions against it, which have been ongoing since the beginning of the construction of Nord Stream 1, and have been egged on by numerous American presidents, starting with Bush and, most recently, Biden. Now, all of these presidents have had a concern that European dependence on Russian oil would make them geopolitically weaker in a situation such as this. And it's worth noting that we are seeing exactly that playing out right now. Because while European sanctions are having an effect on the Russian economy and its ability to support a war machine in the long term, the most effective sanctions that Europe could levy against Russia right now are related to the oil market, and their dependence on Russian oil and natural gas is making it politically impossible for them to follow suit with America. The Nord Stream pipeline in this way is a good example of the constant tension that America has aimed at Russia. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we never really gave them an opportunity to be their own state. Instead, the world largely treated Russia as if it were still the Soviet Union, which is reflected in many places, including the UN, where Russia was the inheritor of the Soviet Union's place on the Council, and also inherited the Soviet Union's powers within the United Union, such as their veto power, which they used to stop the UN Security Council from being able to intervene in this crisis, interestingly enough. And while these may not have been the wrong decisions to make at that time, this does not mean that it is impossible to imagine that the chain of events in the 1990s that could have brought us closer to Russia and could have brought Europe closer with Russia in such a way that this wouldn't be seen as the geopolitical machinations of an opposing state, but instead normal trade relations within a broadened concept of the European Union. And it should be said that Germany's actions in enforcing the Nord Stream 2 pipeline shutdown were incredibly politically brave and ultimately the right thing to do, even if the timing could have been a little bit better. Though, part of the reason that they were willing to agree to this is that modern Germany has a dispassion for war more deeply seated than most European countries, but also thanks to them recently shutting down domestic nuclear power plants. Because of the abundance of cheap energy coming in through the Nord Stream, they are now more dependent on Russian energy than most countries, and are among the only European countries to flat out declare that it would be impossible to sanction Russian energy in any meaningful way from their country because of this. But it reminds us, all of us globally, that our dependence on these authoritarian or imperialist states for a product that we already know is damaging the world, it reminds us that our national sovereignty may be, in some way, come to rest upon our own energy independence. And while we aren't so reliant on Russian oil or gas, we are deeply intertwined with the Saudi Arabian oil kingdom. The more that we use, it makes a damn good case for all countries to seek their own energy independence. As I have mentioned here, I think that the best way to do that long term would be through heavy investments long term in nuclear power, as well as investments in future nuclear technology as well, especially those nuclear technologies that might be able to use more traditional nuclear waste, which is a problem that already exists and isn't going away, so we might as well figure out how to deal with that while we are invigorating nuclear power production. Because while it hasn't been as well funded as it could have been, research into new designs of nuclear power generation have become safer, more sophisticated, smaller, and more efficient since the world went on its last nuclear power building spree. And we can already see how that nuclear power, where it still exists, supports each nation's ability to remain energy independent and thus politically independent from these nations. Unfortunately, though, nuclear power is a solution that, even if we're talking about some of these smaller and more theoretical reactors, would take a little while even if we started building them overnight. Which is exactly why we should also start building a more immediate solution. Weather-dependent electrical solutions are not ideal because they're ultimately intermittent, and intermittency just isn't something that our energy system can rely on. However, they do have a lot of place in building out green infrastructure rapidly. As we work on longer-term solutions like nuclear power, I think another good, clean source of energy comes from hydroelectric power, which unfortunately can have damaging effects on local environments. But it is very safe and an effective form of power that can be deployed in at least a number of places. Though, while it is nowhere near as universal as some other methods of electrical generation, And to fill those gaps, we should be thinking about something like natural gas, which compared to other fossil fuels burns much cleaner in terms of carbon released. And you could make your arguments against this. However, practically speaking, without things like this, we are seeing situations where we're firing up or creating new coal or oil-powered plants now, which we know are bad for the environment, but it's being done because it's a known technology and because it can be built quickly and known to perform reliably. And all of this is going to drive a lot of pushes to expand drilling. I've already heard people on the right calling for the lifting of rules against drilling in national parks, for example. I would absolutely hate to see this jewel that is the U.S. national park system destroyed in such a way for purely short-term gains, for purely short-term gains, when we could be building into long-term solutions that don't hurt our future carbon policy goals. Our plans in this regard shouldn't be either or, but more of an all-of-the-above strategy focused on increasing our national energy independence while lowering costs to the consumer and the amount of carbon emissions. And local clean power is an excellent way of killing two birds with one stone. This is also a concept that can be taken one step further. All of our basic supply chains, all of those that are most fundamental to the operation of our country, should be located within our borders as much as possible. It will take a lot of effort in building out on our part, but the prosperity and independence it will return to our country will be worth it. And to that end, I am actually grateful for Biden to address this during the State of the Union address. However, I would like to see some, firm action on how this would be done. If we do this, we have not adequately prepared for the incoming monster of increased changes to our climate and all of the unpredictability that brings. COVID will not be the last time that our increasingly interdependent supply chains fail all over the world at once. And when it happens again, it will likely be at the most inconvenient possible time. We have already seen this being incredibly destructive to our crumbling infrastructure. And these things will only get worse with time if we ignore them. But right now, it's also important to think of this from the geopolitical perspective. That one of the reasons why Russia is able to keep its economy afloat right now, in spite of sanctions, is because they can depend on our geopolitical dependence on their oil and natural gas abroad. If it were not for this, then our sanctions would be more effective in putting a quick stop to this conflict than they currently are. We perhaps wouldn't have to worry about how long it's going to take for sanctions to have enough effect to be a real deterrent. We could turn off the pumps overnight and cripple their entire economy. In a way, that would be an absolute geopolitical disaster for Putin, in a way that all of our collective sanctions haven't quite been yet. And while we're talking about Russia's resistance to international sanctions, it seems that a large part of this thinking is reliant on Chinese dependence. For example, when we cut them off from credit and banking systems that have become standard in the West, they shifted to a newer Chinese alternative to those systems, legitimizing a bipolar economic system in the world and increasing China's geopolitical power by making Russia more of a dependent state than they ever have been before, which is to say that China has a lot of power in this relationship. But also to say that while China is looking for a greater and more dominant place in the world, they're also quite happy and profiting from the current system, which they have learned how to game quite effectively. And while I am sure that they would rather have the dominant position within this system, or perhaps have their own system be dominant over the Western system, in the short term, the uniformity with which the world that China relies upon as a consumer has rallied against Russia in this conflict, making it almost geopolitically impossible for China to come to Russia's defense in a more meaningful way. And we have seen that this alliance is a lot more uneasy than perhaps Putin has assumed it to be before the conflict started. I think it's also leading to a point where Putin is going to realize that his economy isn't nearly as insulated from the rest of the world as he assumed through this relationship, and that in fact, as Russia is weakened, I believe it will become increasingly geopolitically and economically dependent on China, therefore putting itself into a similar situation that the Nordstream pipelines were designed to put on Europe in relation to Russia. I also don't think that this means that China is about to jump into Taiwan, while everyone else is distracted in Ukraine, as I have heard mentioned. I don't necessarily think that that means that Taiwan is safe long term. I do think that there are reasons to be concerned about that, particular impending crisis. But I don't think that it's going to be happening soon for sure. And, I think this is turning into an approximation. And I really don't see this turning into an approximation of the Cold War. Because they're not fighting the Soviet Union. Ukraine is fighting Russia. Specifically fighting a weakened Russia. Fighting a more globally dependent Russia. And we've all become significantly more globally dependent since the 1990s. Russia being no exception to that. They've just done more things to make the world more economically dependent on them in return.